Okay, thank you very much, Raheel. If I'd known the press conference was on, I would come earlier. I'm in fact a graduate of the University of Western Ontario and lived in London, Ontario for 3 years. Thank you very much indeed. So, as Raheel mentioned, I actually don't have a copy with me. Amazon ran out for a while. They've now got it again, but not in time to get them to me. I'm very glad when people run out of books and have to order more, but it's called Silenced, How Blasphemy and Apostasy Codes Are Children's Freedom Worldwide. I'm going to talk about blasphemy, and when I use the term blasphemy, I include blasphemy, apostasy, insulting religion, defaming Islam. There's about 50 or 60 different expressions, and they're not used with any precision in legal codes elsewhere. So when I use the term blasphemy, it's a catch-all word for all of these things, including a lot of Western hate speech laws. So you get such restrictions outside of a Muslim context. Russia is looking to introduce, or rather strengthen, its blasphemy codes. And people, the girls group Pussy Riot was in fact imprisoned on charges of blasphemy a while ago.
Hooliganism.
Yeah, but yeah, also insulting religion too.
Well, we danced in a church. It's not the same as just...
No, I know. But you could get with trespass and other things. But Russia wants to strengthen those laws. You have them in Greece to some degree, in Germany and in Poland. But 90% plus of the cases we're talking about occur in a Muslim context. So that's what I'm going to focus on. And most of us would now be aware, if we just look at Canada, we had the situation that the writer Mark Steyn, Ezra Levant, who was mentioned earlier, were brought before human rights commissions for, in Mark Steyn's case, a cover story in the largest English language, in probably the best English language news magazine. This is a frightening thing when people are getting hauled into court for what they're writing in the magazine. So we're aware of that. This comes under the category of hate speech, but I'll get back to that. The distinction really doesn't hold up. And then we have events of which we're all aware. Just last fall, a video called The Innocence of Muslims, which had in fact been posted on the internet 3 months before, came to light. And after this, there were demonstrations and riots in Egypt and elsewhere. After someone showed it on an Egyptian television program on September the 11th. Again, so this didn't happen coincidentally. But you have that people are killed, or other famous events. What we usually call the Danish cartoons in the Island Posten in 2005. Swedish cartoons. Benedict XVI went Pope, his Regensburg speech. On a less elevated level, Pastor Terry Jones in Florida, threatening to burn a Quran and then subsequently burning a Quran. These are the events which get the headlines, at least in the West. 2 points I want to make about this. This phenomenon is new. This wasn't happening 25 years ago. There's a couple of reasons why it's happening now. One is the effect of the internet. I mean, 30 years ago, nobody in Afghanistan would know what was in a Danish newspaper, nor would they care, so it didn't come up. Now you can find out, so the occasion is there. But also there are major efforts to make an issue of this. The great turning point was Salman Rushdie's novel, The Satanic Verses. The late Ayatollah Khomeini, the supreme leader in Iran, pronounced a fatwa that it was the duty of every Muslim in the world to kill Rushdie because his novel was blasphemous. Rushdie himself is still alive, though he still has bodyguards. Others were not so fortunate. The Japanese translator was assassinated, the Italian translator was stabbed, the Norwegian publisher was shot, and 35 guests at a Turkish hotel hosting its Turkish publisher were burned to death in an arson attack. Since that time, we have seen growth of international incidents about this. And for many of us, particularly in the West, or even outside the West, our image of what's at stake at blasphemy is is thought to be Danish newspapers, or Ezra Levant, or Pastor Terry Jones. This isn't true. These are less than 1,000th of the cases we're talking about. And in terms of death toll, and injury and imprisonment, they're atypical. So, in the book Silence, we reviewed several thousand blasphemy, apostasy accusations around the world, including in the West. And I want to review briefly some of our findings. First, and I'm focusing on what happens to those who are accused of these things, because this is the biggest worry, though. Okay, the major threat if you're accused of blasphemy or insulting Islam is not from governments. I don't mean governments don't do anything. Governments do a lot of bad things. But your greatest danger is mobs, or some radical imam down the road, whips up a mob and says the people down there, this man or whatever, said or did something blasphemous, and a mob will go down and attack them and maybe kill them. If you look at the country of Pakistan, which in some ways has the world's worst blasphemy codes, paid out two of which carry the death penalty. Nobody in Pakistan, since those laws came in the 1980s, nobody in Pakistan has been executed under those laws. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of people are dead because they're accused and a mob kills them. They're taken to jail and they're killed, sometimes by the police, sometimes by anybody else. They go to prison and they're killed. People have been killed the day they've been acquitted. Just shot on the steps of the court as they come out, being found innocent. So the big governments do execute and imprison people. Iran does this, Saudi Arabia does this, Egypt's doing it increasingly. But the big danger is what mobs and terrorists do here. And that's also true in the West. So the major problem with governments is often that they will not protect people adequately when such accusations are made, and they will not punish those who accuse them. This particularly you see in Pakistan and elsewhere. That one instance I'll get to later is that Salman Taseer, the former governor of Punjab in Pakistan, this is the largest state province in Pakistan, it's almost half the country. Salman Taseer opposed that country's blasphemy laws. And then he was killed, shot multiple times. And the man who killed him was sort of fated as a hero. Very unusually, the man who killed him was put on trial, this is unusual, and was sentenced to death. The judge who passed the sentence was accused of blasphemy. Here you get this weird effect. I told you there's no coherence. Salman Taseer didn't go out and blaspheme in the normal way. He just said, this country's blasphemy laws are terrible. We should change them. So you're accused of blasphemy for wanting to change the blasphemy laws. And then the judge, and he's killed because of that. Then the judge who sentences the man who killed him is accused of blasphemy because he's sentenced to death. The man who killed the man who was accused of blasphemy because he opposed blasphemy. And here you get a chain effect. If someone were now to defend that judge, would they be accused of? The judge has fled from Pakistan. So there's often no coherence, and you get this knock-on effect. And anyway, so governments, this was one case where governments did something, they usually don't, but in most cases, nothing very much happens. So that's the first one. Biggest danger is private retribution and the government standing by and doing nothing. If I may quote Asma Jahangir, who many of you would know, who was chair of Pakistan's Human Rights Commission and also the UN Special Rapporteur on Religious Freedom, said that Pakistan's pattern of violence against religious minorities was helped by local politicians to protect militants and keep their names out of police reports. Here I'm talking a lot about Pakistan. This example could be used in many other ways. To summarize the overall pattern, to quote journalist Sabrina Tavanese in the New York Times, the structure of many of these attacks about blasphemy is this: an intolerant, aggressive minority terrorizes a more open-minded, peaceful majority, while an opportunistic political class dithers, benefiting from alliance with the aggressors. In many of these countries, say even Indonesia, which I know a lot, I know every year, you have two small, more Islamist, by Islamist I mean people who push a reactionary political form of Islam, two small parties, but they hold the balance of power. So the larger parties, which are again largely Muslims, the world's largest Muslim country, who aren't sort of committed to repression themselves, they need the support of these guys. And so they turn a blind eye to attacks on religious minorities, Ahmadis, Shia, and others. And nothing much happens. So the first one is biggest danger, attacks by terrorists or mobs with a government which looks the other way. Secondly, most of these charges are politically manipulated, especially the big international ones. But now, when I say they're politically manipulated, I don't mean that people in this context, Muslims, don't feel insulted and hurt. There's real pain, there's real anger, there's real outrage when things which are either dear to your own heart or which you feel are insulting to God, that outrage and anger is real. If it didn't exist, you can't politically manipulate it. You can't manipulate something unless it's there already. Unless Muslims felt this way, governments and others couldn't use them. But they are used, they are twisted. Let me give you a couple of examples in this. One is, I mentioned, one of the more famous incidents, the cartoons in the Danish newspaper, Jyllands-Posten, often called the Muhammad cartoons. Most of these cartoons, by the way, are pretty harmless. They're humorous, and one just shows a nervous cartoonist looking over his shoulder. There are a couple that people might find offensive. Anyway, these came out in September 2005. What happened? Nothing. Well, I shouldn't say nothing. Danish Muslims protested peacefully outside the office of Jyllands-Posten and said, you shouldn't do things like this. Please don't do it again. No violence, no threats, but just objection. So, which is a good thing in a free society. Some of those cartoons were reprinted in newspapers in Egypt, in Yemen, in Malaysia, with a view to, they printed the milder ones, not for outrage, saying, see what bad things are happening in Denmark, this is terrible. Okay. That's what happened in the fall. Again, nothing. Then the organization of the what was then the Organization of the Islamic Conference, now called the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which is an organization of approximately 56 countries and territories, focused on sort of protecting and promoting the interests of Islam in the world. In its meeting in Mecca in December 2005, 3 months after the cartoons came out, decided to make an issue of them. And member countries, particularly Egypt, particularly Iran, particularly Pakistan, decided to make an issue of this. And then in January and February of 2006, the following year, is when you saw those riots in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Those wouldn't have happened unless some governments decided to try and help them happen by exposing them and then denouncing them. Again, the outrage is real, but these things happened 5 months afterwards. The initial reaction was peaceful protest. One could give many other examples of this. Let me give the negative examples. In 2007, there were cartoons published by a Swedish cartoonist named Lars Vilks, which are far more offensive than the Danish ones. What happened with that? Nothing that I know. When I say nothing, I mean no violence, no riots, no bad things. There were demonstrations, people writing letters, complaining to the newspaper, and so on. Terry Jones, when he threatened to burn a Koran, I mean, he gets the involvement, very stupid involvement of the American Secretary of State, the American Secretary of Defense, the American President. I mean, this man is in heaven. He makes this threat, he's on TV so every day. Someone even offered him a free SUV if he wouldn't, this is the truth, if he wouldn't burn a Koran. And you know, this is stupid. I mean, this is America. I mean, it didn't happen, but I thought 1,000 people would write in, I won't burn the Koran if you give me an SUV. I mean, you just, the guy should have been ignored and just have a little note somewhere. So there was all that attention. Later on, and again, people died. Later on, he actually did burn a Koran. And most of the media decided to ignore him. Not to bury it completely, but page A17, idiot burns Koran. And then there was no reaction. So you see these very different responses. Even the sort of latest one, this sort of video called The Innocence of Muslims, it was 3 months after it appeared that Sheikh Khalid Abdullah, an Egyptian TV personality, showed some segments of this on September the 11th, and then, of course, then there was the eruption. So the insult is real, but the big events, that is, if there's a riot in a village, maybe not, but if you're reading about it in the West, that's because someone wants you, and it wants someone in Jordan, or Egypt, or elsewhere to hear about it. And all those countries have controlled press. So, danger of mob attacks, secondly, political manipulation. Vague charges, I've already mentioned some of these. Pakistan has a very explicit blasphemy code. This is unusual. There are actually 5 different blasphemy laws in Pakistan. Indonesia also has one. Many other countries don't. Egypt has a law against insulting a heavenly religion, which would mean Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. In other countries, they may appeal directly to Islamic law, Sharia, some particular version of Sharia. Iran has a whole list, and various offences include hurting Muslims' feelings, creating confusion amongst Muslims, imitating Christians. That is an offence in, presumably it's not an offence to the Christians in Iran to imitate Christians. Or, you know, friendship with the enemies of God. And these sorts of charges, they multiply. There's about 50 or 60 which we've listed in Iran. Propagation of spiritual liberalism. In the case of just looking at Iran, a case you probably would have heard of, Pastor Yusuf Nadarkhani, who was originally sentenced to death for apostasy that he had converted from Islam. There is in statute, in laws in Iran, there is no law against apostasy, actually on the books. And in this case, what the court did was simply appeal to the writings of the late Ayatollah Khomeini. He said, Imam Khomeini said you should kill someone who does this, therefore you're sentenced to death. So it's exceedingly difficult for people to know, particularly the Muslim world, you know, when you might have broken this law. And the point I will get into is most of the cases are not insults, like say Terry Jones burning a Quran that's meant to be insulting. Most of them are disagreements that someone objects to them. So, and my fourth major point is who are most of the victims? Who are these charges usually leveled against? Who gets hurt because of it? 4 basic categories, which I'll unpack. One is, there's no good term for it, I'm going to say, followers of post-Islamic faiths. Secondly is apostates, or people who actually leave Islam. The third is Muslims of a different type. And the fourth is, I'll say, Muslim reforms. Let me say a bit about each of these categories. By post-Islamic religions, I mean people who hold that or are thought to hold that there is a prophet after Muhammad. One group, as you would probably know, is the Ahmadiyya, the Ahmadis. They say they don't in fact believe that, but they're often thought to. So they are understood by their very existence to be sort of criticizing, contradicting Islam. So they are persecuted, most especially in Pakistan, where the largest concentration is. But in very many other countries. Some Ahmadis were killed in Indonesia a while back, and there are laws restricting them in many parts of the world. If you're a Muslim, Pakistani, and you want a Pakistani passport, on the form you fill out, you have to denounce and reject the Qadianis, as they're called. If you go to the website of the Pakistani embassy here in Canada, there will be a form you will be required to sign denouncing that. The former Pakistani ambassador to the US, a friend of mine, Hussein Akhani, who's now one of my colleagues at the Hudson Institute. This was on the website when he was the ambassador, which caused him, acute embarrassment because he couldn't stand that sort of thing. But this is the level to which it will go. So Ahmadis have great difficulty throughout the world. The other major group is the Baha'is. And again, throughout much of the Muslim world, they suffer. Some exceptions, Senegal, Mali, at least southern Mali, generally didn't have too much problems. But in much of the rest of the Muslim world, they do. And the largest single grouping of Baha'is would be in Iran, where they suffer terribly. The 10 major leaders of the Baha'i community in Iran are currently in prison. The Baha'is have no legal status in Iran, which means if a Baha'i is killed, there is no legal consequence. There's no legal effect. It was if you were to kill a bird on the tree. That's not a matter for the police here in Iran. That would be the case with killing or injuring a Baha'i. So they're regarded here, probably the term, most applicable term using in English, or using a sort of Christian term, would be something like heretic rather than blasphemer. But as a community en masse, they're out there. The second group is actual converts. There's people who leave Islam to they become atheists, or they convert to another religion. Usually that's Christianity, if Muslims convert. But in Malaysia, more commonly, it's Buddhism and Hinduism. That's usually around marriage, rather than sort of heartfelt, I now believe something different. Many of these cases are around marriage. But again, such converts can be hounded, or imprisoned, or in some cases killed. There have not been any state executions recently. The last ones I know of were in Iran in the 1990s. But such converts are under threat even in the West. So that's the second category of who it affects. The third is Muslims of the wrong type. That is, if you're a Sunni in, say, Iran, you're not directly persecuted, but you are a second-class citizen. You can have great difficulty having a mosque. Similarly, Shia in Egypt have an extremely rough time. They're not allowed to have mosques. Their leaders have been imprisoned and tortured. So Shia are restricted in places such as Malaysia. There's even been some persecution of Shia in Indonesia. Even though the Shia, I just found there's likely going to be a translation of the book Silence into Indonesian, and the publisher who's going to do that is owned by Shiites. And I said, isn't this a problem? No, they're the largest publisher of Islamic books, including the Sunni ones in Indonesia. So that's the background. Usually there have not been these problems. But people have been denouncing Shia in Indonesia as heretics, and one of their villages was attacked last September. So again, here what we're dealing with is Muslims who are not blasphemers or contradicting Islam or whatever, they're of a Shia-Sunni divide. And then particularly if you get groups such as Ismailis, then life gets even more difficult, particularly now in Saudi Arabia and the southern parts where there are quite a few Ismailis. Now the fourth category, I want to spend a little more time on, the fourth category of victims is Muslim reformers, or Muslims committed to freedom, or artistic freedom, or many things of these kinds. One, just take an example, is novelists. Naguib Mahfouz, the Egyptian Nobel Prize winner in literature. If you haven't read any of his novels, I recommend them because they bring life in Cairo into life. I mean, I've never lived in Cairo, particularly in the areas he's talking about, but there's a rich reality to it. A world is being evoked here. And he won the Nobel Prize. But because he portrayed Muslims and imams, good and bad in everyday life, he's a novelist, many of his books were banned in Egypt. And then, in, I think it was 1991, he was stabbed by a member of Jamaat Islamiyah who thought he was blasphemous. And he was partially paralyzed for the rest of his life. And again, for most of his life, he won a Nobel Prize, but he couldn't publish at home. Or perhaps the most famous Arab poet, usually called the nickname Adonis or Adonis. He hasn't been killed, but he was invited to speak in Algeria's National Library. He gave a lecture arguing that Islamist attempts to impose their religion on society and the state were wrong. Islamists in Algeria accused him of being an apostate. The Minister of Culture of Algeria then denounced him and fired the library's director for inviting him. And that's a more common instance, and people get killed, but it's the repression here. So the next library director is not going to invite someone like this, and probably nobody else is. So a lot of creative expression of novelists and poets is damped down. In the case of journalists, there could be many examples. One major one of my favorites, Ali Mahakek Nasib, editor of the Afghan magazine Women's Rights. He was a man, this is Afghanistan after all. But very interesting articles in there. But at the time, an apostate was on trial in Afghanistan. He published an article saying, does Islam really require us to kill apostates or to stone adulterers? And of course, he was charged with blasphemy for raising these questions. Again, he was not blasphemous, insulting, saying hurtful things. He's asking questions about, let's have a debate within Islam about this. But then he's in prison. Journalists shade into democracy activists. Muhammad Yunus Sheikh, member of Pakistan's Human Rights Commission, raised questions about Pakistan's policies in Kashmir. Okay. The following day, he was charged by the students of having blasphemed in his class. Okay, here the timing is significant. I mean, the guy'd been teaching for 30 years. One day after he says something unpopular in front of an army officer, someone accuses blasphemy, which brings up the other factor that many of these charges are simply false. It's a way of score settling. You have a problem with someone, you want them to sell their business, they're not doing it, well, you accuse them of blasphemy. And they're going to have a rough time. Just one more example in terms of activists. Iranian Nobel Peace Prize laureate Shirin Ebadi, who's been in Canada for a while, lectured at my daughter's entrance to the bar here in Toronto just over a year ago. She again is a committed Muslim, isn't going around blaspheming, but she defended all sorts of unpopular people in Iran, including the Baha'is. So she was accused of blasphemy for legally defending other people. Here you see the spin-off effects. or Islamic theologians. Could give, again, many examples. One is Iranian cleric Mohsen Kadivar, who's been in the West now for many years. He was imprisoned for, quote, publishing untruths and disturbing public mind in Iran. How did he do this? He wrote a 3-volume work entitled The Theory of the State in Shiite Jurisprudence. Okay, this is a heavy, dense, thoughtful work by a major scholar. Again, nothing blasphemous in the normal context of what would use blasphemy, but he disagreed with Ayatollah Khomeini's view of the guardianship of the jurist, that the Islamic jurist, the Islamic scholar, should actually run the country. And he said, that has no foundation in Shiite jurisprudence, which is that he's arguing the traditional view. Khomeini is the innovator here. He had very unusual views. But he's put in prison for that. So here you're seeing a pattern. I could give many other examples of this. I gave this lecture in Georgetown University, a variation of this, and illustrated this particular section on on theologians simply by using Georgetown faculty. These are people who, in the end, like Kadivar, had to flee Iran. And some had employed at Duke in England and other places, but these 3 had been visiting professors at Georgetown. And I said, your university itself has, of course, benefited from these people, but the fact you can give a lecture in university and point out you're getting your faculty because of laws like this, that these people have to flee the places they're in. These threats also, as I'm sure many of you would know, these threats extend to Muslims in the West. One would include probably still the best-known human rights activist in the Arab world, Saladin Ibrahim. He's been charged with the Egyptian government for threats against the state and so on. He's not been charged in Egypt with blasphemy. But terrorist groups have threatened him for advocating human rights, for criticizing the Muslim Brotherhood. And he and many other Muslims, 26 of them, in one emailing several years ago, were told they must repent and stop, or they would be killed. And these people, probably some of the people in this room, are used to getting death threats. But in this case, it listed the name of their spouse and the names of the children and the address. So, here's a Muslim in the West, simply a human rights activist. Other cases, Shahin Najafi, an Iranian rap singer living in Germany, was declared an apostate because of his rap music. The first Muslim member of Germany's parliament, member of the Green Party, Ekin Delikos, received death threats because she called for Muslim women to take off their headscarf. Mimoun Boussakla, a senator in Belgium. So these are prominent Muslim women in high political positions in the West. Boussakla was forced into hiding after threats to ritually slaughter her because she criticized women's positions in Muslim communities in Belgium. So these threats reach here. And one of my big concerns is that in the West, under what is usually called something like hate speech laws, we are falling into the same pattern here. That for many people in the West, the image is, oh, well, a big problem is people making insulting remarks, and we should stop that. But the main problem isn't this. It's that hundreds of people are getting killed and thousands of people are being thrown in prison because charges like this are thrown around loosely. Mark Stein, I mentioned, Ezra Levant, cases in the US. Of course, they won their cases. Many similar cases in Australia, everywhere else. But in this case, you know the saying, the process is the punishment. You spend 3 years of your life involved in this. You don't know what's going to happen. You spend hundreds of thousands of dollars. For most people in the world who don't know you apart from this, if your name ever comes up and says, oh, wasn't that the guy who was, and that's it. And that's after you win. So you have these cases, Finnish politician, A member of Helsinki's city council was charged and imprisoned. The Dutch politician Geert Wilders, who I don't particularly like, I think he is provocative. But when the head of the third most popular party in the country in a democracy is being put on trial for what he says in his political speeches, there's problems with this. Or more recently, another friend of mine, Tom Holland, an award-winning Cambridge-educated historian, who until last year was chair of the Society of Authors in England. Again, he has had threats for a recent book he has had on Islam. Channel 4, the BBC cancelled his program because of what he calls security concerns. Then you've got the people who made the South Park cartoon strip and so on in the US. So you're getting a sort of clampdown, a silencing in the West. You mentioned it in the title of political correctness. But also a fear of threat. And then a fear of governments who think they're going to buy peace. You know, thinking if we can stop these people making hurtful remarks, everything will be well. But it won't, because the range of what can be considered hurtful expands. Will we shut up Baha'is in Canada? Will we shut up Baha'is? If you want to assuage some radicals, that's how far you would have to go. And one of the major effects of this is, here I've talked about direct threats of people who've been silenced because they've been killed, like Salman Taseer, or thrown into prison, or threatened, or dragged through trials. These people are silenced. But the larger number of people who are silenced are the people who watch what happened to somebody else and decide they're not going to open their mouth. If you're an Egyptian novelist, you're going to watch what you put in those novels. If you're the new director of the National Library of Algeria, you'll know who to invite and not to invite. If you are a theologian, including grand ayatollahs in Iran, you might be careful about what you write. If you're a journalist or any of these people. So you get this silencing. But I'll make some comments on the West, and then I'll close with some of the effects that it has in the Muslim world. That many of our media don't take up these issues. The British Broadcasting Corporation says it did not show certain things because it didn't want to sort of mock religion. BBC, by the way, their Easter special this year was on dealing with a purported affair between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Mm-hmm. So it's not worried about offending certain religions. But they will mock other religions. The British comedian Ben Elton, who was attacking the BBC, on which he has a show, correctly said of them, it's simply too scared to allow jokes about Islam. You can make jokes about vicars, that is, Anglican clergymen. You can't get jokes about imams. They pretend that it has something to do, with moral sensibilities. It isn't. They're scared. To take another example from British comedian Rowan Atkinson, Blackadder, or Mr. Bean, who's been very strong in the United Kingdom. Britain wanted to introduce a blasphemy law. The existing blasphemy law only dealt with blasphemy against the Church of England. I mean, not even Methodist. You could insult Methodists, there was no problem. Church of England, that's where it protected. Obviously, it's a problem with such a law. The British government proposed to ban insults against everybody. Ben Elton was strong on this, and so was Rowan Atkinson. He pushed it very strongly. And said, one of the things about such laws is they don't work. To quote him, they produce a surface veneer of tolerance, concealing a snake pit of unerred and unchallenged views. People don't stop thinking these things if you don't allow them to say them. They say them privately in quiet. And people will often also feel victimized and heroic because of this. Europe has far more restrictive hate speech laws than we do, mainly against Nazism. Of course, they have far more Nazis than we do. And the laws aren't having much effect. To take one spectacular example, if you remember Anders Behring Breivik, the Norwegian man who killed probably 70 other people because he believed they tolerated the immigration of Muslims to Norway too easily. So he didn't actually kill any Muslims, but it was his anti-Muslim attitude which certainly inspired him. So Norway has strong hate speech laws. One of the responses in the Parliament is, we need to strengthen our hate speech laws. Why this would stop him from shooting anybody, I have no idea. In fact, I would say the thing is the opposite, because Breivik said, this is the only way I could be hurt. Well, he meant, I mean, I also think he's crazy.
Yeah, what did he say?
But clearly, yeah, more laws to try and shut up a man like this are not going to have the effect. You could, I can't prove it, but it's at least plausible the fact that he wasn't allowed to say it otherwise, then says, okay, I'm going to kill dozens of people and I'm going to have a trial and you'll all get to listen to me what I want to say. He wanted a political trial. This was an act of speech. So these restrictive laws don't work. And in fact, a research organization, the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, probably the best source of religion statistics in the world. I have no work with them. I have no connection with them. They produce really good work. One of their staff members, Brian Grimm, and a colleague produced a book 2 years ago called The Price of Freedom Denied. They studied 200 countries, not just Muslim countries, but 200, pretty well every country in the world they could get data. You can't get data from North Korea. Everywhere you could get data. And said, laws which repress religious freedom lead to increased religious violence. Let me repeat this. Laws which repress religious freedom, which includes the freedom to disagree with someone else, the freedom to be an atheist, to tell someone you think their religion is wrong, or even to insult them. Religious freedom means you can do those things. You shouldn't do them, but you're quite free to do them. Laws which control those lead to increased religious violence. Canada will probably get more violence the degree it tries to control speech. So this is one of the effects in the world at large. If we go back to the spin-off effects, particularly in the Muslim world, I mentioned Muslim reformers, journalists, novelists, theologians, political activists, human rights activists, who get silenced. Because, as you know, Islam, like really every other religion, is not only teaching about a narrow area of life, but affects your views of the nature of culture, the nature of society, the nature of marriage, the nature of politics. Doesn't mean it determines it, necessarily, but it means it shapes it. So if you're not free to argue about Islam, or within Islam, a whole area of discussion about the nature of life is off limits. So, if you forbid religious criticism, you forbid criticism of an awful lot of other things in life which are connected to this, to religion. I mentioned Salman Taseer earlier, the governor of Punjab, who was killed for opposing the blasphemy laws. His daughter, Sarah, we had her speak at the Hudson Institute, and a line she used, a line she had in an article too, it says, the killing of her father was a message. It says, it's a message. This is a message to every liberal. Shut up or be shot. That's the bluntest way of saying it. I'm talking about liberals in politics. I don't mean liberal like the Liberal Party. I mean people who believe in freedom, to allow people to live their lives in society. And Muslim liberals. And again, here I mean the stress on freedom. Two closing quotations. One is from the late Nasser Abu Zaid, an Egyptian scholar who was driven out of Egypt because of his writings. Again, a believing Muslim. We had asked him to write an essay which we included in the book Silenced, reflecting on his own life. He says, accusations of blasphemy are key weapons in the fundamentalists' arsenal to prevent reform of Muslim societies. and they confine the world's Muslim population to a bleak, colorless prison of socio-cultural and political conformity. And then to quote the late Abdul Rahman Wahid, the former president of Indonesia, the world's largest Muslim country, former president of Nahdlatul Ulama, the world's largest Muslim organization, who, if I may add, he wrote the foreword to our book, Silence was the last thing. He wrote, in the foreword, he said, coercively applied blasphemy laws narrow the bounds of acceptable discourse, not just about religion, narrowly understood, but about vast spheres of life, literature, science, and culture. To continue, I'm still quoting Wahid. Rather than encourage Muslim fundamentalists in their efforts to impose a spiritually void, harsh, and monolithic understanding of Islam upon all the world, Western authorities and Westerners should instead firmly defend freedom of expression. When politics and religion are intertwined, as they necessarily are in debates about banning blasphemy, then without religious debate and criticism, there can be no political debate and criticism. Thank you very much.